Morning, Year 4. Welcome back for another day of English today, where today we're going to continue thinking about our poetry. So, just before we get started, then, let's have a quick recap with yesterday's learning. And I'll pop that toolbox there as a bit of a reminder. What poetic tools or techniques did we look at yesterday that we know that we can use when writing poems? What can you remember? Yeah, you're right. You'll remember the word rhythm was one of those techniques where we think about perhaps the beats in a line in a poem and the way that the poem might use a pattern perhaps to be able to bring it to life. So, yeah, well done if you remembered that one. I wonder if you remembered rhyme, where we think about the end of the word and the sound that the word makes at the end to make a quite similar sound to another word. And we usually pop those at the end of a line in a poem so that they're most obvious. Okay, so yeah, well done if you remembered rhyme. What else can you remember from yesterday? I wonder if you could remember similes, because we know that that's when we're using the word like or as to be able to describe something to be like something else, when we compare something. What else? Yes, that new piece of learning from yesterday are metaphors. And I know you had a go at writing your own metaphors yesterday as well. And you'll remember that a metaphor is something where we describe something as something else to give us a little bit more information about something. I saw some really great metaphors that you had a go at using yesterday. Well done. And then another one that we spoke about, which we talked about before already this year, are kennings, and that's going to be quite important for today. And we know that kennings were very popular in Anglo-Saxon times because they're two words to describe something without using its name. Okay, so again, we referred to Starcad's sword, didn't we, yesterday, to remind us of that as leg biter. Okay, so those 5 techniques are the 5 techniques that we're going to be focusing on, first of all today, but they're going to become a theme throughout each of these lessons this week, because the aim for our learning this week is that by the end of the week you will have had a go at writing your own poem to include all of these techniques. Okay, so before we have a go at writing our own poem ourselves, we're going to have a go at today at creating a poem using some lines that have already been written for us. Okay, so this type of poem is called a jigsaw poem, and you'll see why we call it a jigsaw poem in a moment. Okay, so I'm providing you with 2 different titles of a poem, and today you're going to be choosing which one you want to do. So you might want your poem to be called The Sleeping Sword. Okay, or you might want your poem to be called The Axe of Truth. Can you see we've got a Viking theme to our poems? That's right, at the end of the week you will have written your very own Viking poem. Okay, and we're going to use Viking weapons as the theme, as the context for our writing. So before we have a go at creating our own poems, it's going to be really, really important that we have a look at some of these lines that have been written and see if we can spot any of the tools that we've already talked about, because they're going to be really, really important when we come to make our choice as to the order that our poem's going to go in. Okay, so what I'd like you to do in a moment is pause this video, have a read of the different lines that we could potentially be using in our poems today. Have a read of them, and I just want you to see if you can spot any similes, any metaphors, any examples of alliteration, any kennings, any things like that. Okay, and you don't need to write anything down. You could either chat about it to somebody in your house, or you could do some highlighting. Again, you'll find these examples on the Google Drive there to help you, so you could do some highlighting like yesterday. Okay, so pause now. What features can you spot? Welcome back. So, what did you find? Let's have a look at the examples on the sleeping sword example first of all. So, the first one there that springs to me is it's right at the top there, slicing and dicing. Yeah, that's an example of rhyming, isn't it? A sword is a death bringer. Death bringer is an example of a kenning there. Forged in a fire. Example of alliteration there. Made by the hands of the gods. Okay, it's a little bit of description, perhaps not necessarily one of those features that we talked about, but that's still quite figurative in the fact that it puts an image in our mind, doesn't it, when we read that? As sharp as a razor, a simile. As cold as the grave, another example of a simile. A warrior's best friend. That could be an example of a metaphor there, couldn't it? Because it's not a person to be a friend, but we're saying it is a warrior's best friend. That could be an example of a metaphor. An enigmatic enemy. Enigmatic is a posh word for meaning mysterious, so it leaves you guessing. Okay, an example of alliteration there. To feed the eagles. Again, some figurative language. Perhaps we could see that as a metaphor as well, because we wouldn't actually feed the eagles with a sword, would we? Okay. Fortune will smile upon the brave. So somebody who uses a sword will become quite fortunate, is what that means. Can it actually smile? Bring on the bold, alliteration there. And make light of battle, so making the battle easy. Okay. So loads of different of those poetic techniques that we've seen there. I wonder if you spotted any others in here. A blood axe, Thor's defender, that would be an example of a kenning there, wouldn't it? As golden as the tears of Freya, I can see as in there, so I know that's an example of a simile. The chieftain's protector, so that must be an example of a kenning, chieftain's protector, protecting the chief. At times of fierce combat, that might be when they use some powerful adjectives there, when they use that axe of truth. She is the jewel of the warrior. So that's definitely an example of a metaphor there, isn't it? Saying it is a jewel, even though it's not. A breaker of rings. Okay, so what the axe is used for, perhaps that might be an example of a kenning. Ring breaker, perhaps. As sharp as a lightning bolt, an example of a simile there. And bringing freedom to the world, as strong as a war horse, another example of a simile there. Glinting brightly in the sun, some powerful adjectives. Silent and deadly, and again, some more adjectives and adverbs there. So, now that we've unpicked those different features that we can spot there, I want us to think about how those features can make us choose an order, okay? And how I can then jigsaw, now you'll see why it's called a jigsaw poem, how I can jigsaw each of those words and lines separately and put them in the order that I choose. So I'm going to go back to choosing my title. I think my title is going to be The Sleeping Sword. Okay, so I'm going to write that on my piece of paper at the top, and you will do the same in a minute. Okay, so The Sleeping Sword. So to show that's my title, I'm going to underline it there. And as I say, I'm going to move that to the top of my page. So these I can move around, as you can see, like jigsaw pieces. So now that I've thought about the different features, that's going to help me decide what order I go in. So The Sleeping Sword. I'm going to start off with a simile at the beginning, as sharp as a razor, and then to make a little bit of a figurative idea, put a bit of an image in my reader's mind, I'm going to say made by the hands of God. Okay, so it adds a little bit of description there. Then, because I've used a simile here, I think it might be quite nice to have some rhyme going next. Slicing and dicing. So I'm trying to think about varying my choices as I go. I don't want lots of the same things together. Okay, I'm trying to spread them out in my poem. And you'll notice that I've got quite a short line here, as sharp as a razor, and quite a short line here, slicing and dicing. But the line in the middle is a little bit longer. So I'm going to go for another little bit of a longer line. Fortune will smile upon the brave. And by doing that, I've created a little bit of a rhythm. So short line, short line, long line. Okay. And if I was to think of the beats in the word, I could see that I would have fewer beats with more beats. And that is exactly what rhythm is. So I've created the first verse to my poem. I've used 4 of those lines and I've placed them together. So when I come to the next part of my poem, as I move down the page, I'm then going to leave a bit of a gap to show that I'm onto a new verse. A sword is a death bringer. I haven't used a kenning yet, so I'm going to go with that idea next. Forged in a fire. So that is using my alliteration because I haven't thought about that yet. It might be quite nice to use some more alliteration here. Bring on the bold, perhaps. And again, look, I've followed a rhythm again. This time I've got longer, shorter, shorter. So then perhaps I could do a bit of a longer one at the end there and make light of battle. Okay. I've still got some lines that I might want to use, which I could put into a third verse perhaps, but you can see that I've been able to jigsaw the lines in that poem together. Okay, really thinking about the order of the features in order to help me to make that decision. Okay, and that's going to be your job today. You'll find these on the Google Drive. I want you to choose the Sleeping Sword or the Axe of Truth, okay, as your title for your poem. Now, it might be that you want to come up with your own title for a poem, and in which case you might not use either of those titles, and instead you might mix these cards together and use a variety of them, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, I would like you to choose an example of a title, and as I say, you can choose one of these if you want to, and I want you to have a go at creating your own jigsaw poem. So if you can print these out, great. If not, can you write the lines of these poems on little bits of paper? Okay, cut them out so that you can move them, and it's really, really important that you do move them around the page in order to be able to experiment with the order. Now, in order to help you to decide whether it's in the best order or whether perhaps you could improve that, you're going to have to think about performing your poem as well. So I want you to read it aloud, okay? And you could read that aloud to an audience, perhaps a parent or a sibling, or your whole family if you're confident to, or you could just read it aloud to yourself and see how it sounds, and that's absolutely fine too. But you'll find once you're performing your poem and you're reading it aloud, try and get a little bit of drama in there, okay, to make your poem sound interesting while you're reading. It might be that while you're doing that, you might decide to change the order up again. Okay, so you might then move those cards back round again in order to create a different order because you might prefer it that way and it might sound a little bit more dramatic. The purpose of these poems, if we're going to be writing a poem about a sword or an axe, we definitely want them to be dramatic, don't we? That's going to be the purpose. So I want you to think about the best order where you think it can be most dramatic, okay, and move them around. When you're happy with your order and your performing has helped you to decide that, perhaps you could glue them down on your paper, okay, to see how your poem comes together. As a bit of an extra challenge, as a final task today, I want you to cut up some cards, just little bits of paper, little squares of paper that are blank, because then I want you to have a go at writing your own lines as well, okay? And I'm expecting all of you to do at least 2 of your own cards, okay? And you're going to decide where in your poem you want them to go. I'd be super impressed, as it was yesterday's learning, to show and apply that learning from yesterday, if you could include an example of a metaphor for your Viking weapon that you've chosen, okay? Or could you do a kenning? As we're writing about Viking weapons, they would work really well, wouldn't they, in that sort of a poem? If you don't want to do a kenning, could you do an example of a simile? Could you do an example of alliteration? Okay, but I want to see at least 2 of your own cards. You could do 3 or 4, however many you want to, but I want you to choose 2, at least 2 of your own cards that you've written your own lines for them and thinking about where in your poem you're going to place them. Okay, if you are really brave, as I know some of you are, I'd love it if when you're performing your poem, when you've got your final poem and you're happy with it, including your own lines, I'd love it if you could video them and send them to me. I'd really love to see some of these poems being performed. Okay, have fun today, guys. Can't wait to read them and see some of your videos. Bye for now.